Well, it's lovely to be here, and I'd really like to thank you all for a fascinating couple of days. My presentation, the title changed from when I submitted it the first time round. Then I was really being pushed to come up with a title, and I still had no idea. So today, the title is different to what's in the program. It's Down the Rabbit Hole, because that's where I feel I've been, with Sofia, and I'll talk about Sofia and Gaia. And what I'm going to suggest today, and I already know that I'm being provocative and I'm keeping away from Guy, who I love very much, is that perhaps we should be talking about decentering youth in youth work. And as always, my presentations will be unapologetically political. So let me start with this. For me, these last couple of days have been fascinating, not least because when it comes to green, I am very green. I've been to a couple of climate protests. I separate my rubbish, but I really don't have much in terms of green credentials. And this is all very, very new to me. And I came into this way of thinking, this new way of thinking, as a result of what I'm going to call a tale of two Sofias. And I'll tell you the tale of two Sofias later on. I'll then tell you about what happened after I thought about Sofias, and a trip to Kakuma, and a burning planet that Nick has already referred to. And that is what took me on a journey, like Alice, down the rabbit hole. And I don't think I've come out of that rabbit hole. I'm still there. I'm going to suggest that we look at a critical post-human youth work as a way of moving forward. And this way of thinking does become, as Alice said, curiouser and curiouser, and that we need to queer everything up. I'm going to be suggesting a new materialism to think about what it means to be human, to be a human animal, and to think about, so an ontological way of thinking and an onto-epistemological way of thinking, knowing in being and becoming. Knowing in being and becoming, the ontological and the epistemological cannot be separated. I'm going to suggest a more than human youth work praxis. Doesn't mean that we don't include the human, but it's more than human. And lastly, I cling to hope. And I think that's a little bit similar to the innocence that Nick spoke of. Cynicism is compliance, and hope, I believe, is a political act. So as a youth worker, so I'm a youth worker and I'm an academic. We can talk about the definitions of what youth work is. I'm post-youth, and by some definitions of youth, I'm still not a young person. That ship sailed a long, long time ago. But as a youth worker, most of my work in the last 18 years has been engaged with young refugees. And this is where my journey, or this journey perhaps, this new way of thinking started. In thinking about borders, when I was doing my PhD, I came up with a term. It was something that I was particularly bored, I think, at the time, of homo migratus. The point being that as long as humans have been on this planet, and it's actually a very, very short amount of time in the bigger picture, we have migrated. To be human is also to migrate, homo migratus. But of course, not everybody gets to migrate in the same way. The Mediterranean, not just the Mediterranean, but the Mediterranean is actually the most deadly route in the world. And over the last 2 decades, not just since 2015, for more than that, more than 2 decades now, predominantly young people have been dying in the Mediterranean. Their migration is illegalized. They're often defined as illegal immigrants, as if these human beings, their very being, their very presence, is illegal. It's not rocket science, really, if we really don't want young people to be dying in the Mediterranean, we could just provide them with a safe and legal option, the opportunity to travel in the way that I travel. Give them a passport, give them a document, give them a travel document, and no one needs to get on a boat. It's actually very simple, and yet we don't do it. So this is my work. And this is a tale of two Sofias. There is baby Sofia, and there is Sofia, the cyborg. Baby Sofia, are any of you familiar with Operation Sofia? Okay, so Operation Sofia was the name of the, it finished quite recently, of the operation in the Mediterranean that was established following the shipwrecks and the deaths to save migrants, but also the onus being specifically on protecting our borders. When I say our, I'm talking about European. Baby Sofia was denied the opportunity to say, well, her mother was denied the opportunity to travel to request asylum, actually, because if you think about it, it's really fucked up. Those people that really need to travel the most are the ones that denied the opportunity to travel. Once Syria imploded, their visa, it was at that point that their opportunity to access visas was denied. You'd think it would be the other way around. So baby Sofia was born on a German vessel that was there monitoring the borders. And so they decided to call the operation to protect our borders and to save lives, Operation Sofia. Of course, Sofia is not a citizen of Europe or any nation state within Europe. This is Sofia the cyborg. It was around 2015, I think. I can't remember. It could have been 2017. I've probably got it written down somewhere. It's not the point. Sofia the cyborg came to visit Malta. She came on a plane, and one of our ministers in Malta said it's time to start talking about giving access to citizenship to cyborgs. And for me, that was a what the fuck moment. Now, it doesn't mean that I have an issue with tech per se, but surely it raises questions again about what it means to be human, and in my case, who has the right to rights. It was around that time that I was also visiting Kakuma refugee camp in the north of Kenya, to do some work with young refugees there. And it was whilst I was in Kakuma, I remember I had already started this journey. I burnt out. I was moving towards burning out. And I remember getting to the camp and texting my partner and saying, this is where hope comes to die. And then I met a young woman who had essentially lived in Kakuma all of her life, in a camp. She's not allowed to leave the camp. And she told me, welcome to my home, Kakuma, the land of hope. And it was another what the fuck moment. The reason why the EU funds the camps is to keep the refugees in the camps. As long as they're in Kakuma, they're not coming to Europe. So we can already see a strong link here between European funds and the life of a young refugee in Kakuma. I'm not really going to talk about climate refugees, and I think Nick covered it already. But what I'm starting to say is these things are linked. So I've started to engage in new ways of thinking, and I came across this quote by Latour, and I thought that was amazing. Have you noticed that the emotions involved are not the same when you're asked to defend nature, you yawn, you're bored, as when you're asked to defend your territory, now you're wide awake and suddenly mobilized? And in Malta, we've had many protests calling for the militarization of our borders. And throughout Europe and around the world, we see more and more of these borders, deadly borders, to protect our territory. and yet the link with our land, with what that means in terms of nature, is rarely made. While I was on the runway in Kakuma, I was flipping through. I didn't actually have access to internet, but you know when it freezes on your phone? Well, it was at that time that there was the forest fires, the fires in Brazil. And Macron was particularly pissed off. There was this argument on the international stage, and he said, "Our house is burning." Literally. The Amazon rainforest, the lungs which produces 20% of our planet's oxygen, is on fire. It's an international crisis. And I thought, well, that's a funny thing. When does nation matter and when does it not matter? When are we able to transcend borders, and who gets to transcend borders and who doesn't? So suddenly what's happening in Brazil matters, but then something else that happens within the nation is nobody else's business. So the way we play around with the nation and with borders and what transcends borders, well, it's complex, but I think it's linked. And now I want to bring in a term that is new to my vocabulary, as is many of the points that I'll be raising today, and that's the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene refers to the epoch of large-scale, human-driven changes to the Earth and its ecosystem. I know I'm preaching to the translated here. This is new for me, but it isn't new for many of you. Evidence for the Anthropocene is well documented and evident in pollution, physical changes caused by urbanization, sea level rise, global warming, and biological changes linked to species invasion and extinction. Globalization, climate change, and the destruction of the biosphere has facilitated the spread of new pathogens as they cross species and borders, including, but not limited to, COVID-19. So it's human beings, it's human-driven. We are impacting climate change and everything else that goes with the destruction of the planet. I want to bring in here Haraway, who critiques the term Anthropocene and the notion that this is a species act, because of course we know that not all human beings are responsible in the same way for this destruction. And she asks us to use the term capitalocene or Cluthocene or whatever. There are so many other terms. It's not the point for now. I'm reminded of Bauman, whilst the riches are global, the misery is local. And I came across another Haraway quote. She's speaking about somebody else's research, and I thought it was important. He is saying that his research shows that our entire economic paradigm is a threat to ecological stability. Werner is not the first or the last researcher and maker of matters of concern to argue this point, but his clarity at a scientific meeting is bracing. Revolt. Think we must. We must think. Actually think, not like Eichmann as in the banality of evil, not like Eichmann, the thoughtless. Of course, the devil is in the detail. How to revolt, how to matter, and not just want to matter. And I wanted to bring capitalism, well, we've been speaking about it the last couple of days, but I think now I'm even more happy that I included this slide, because we need to be speaking about capitalism and not sort of moving around capitalism as if it's there, but not, it's the elephant in the room and we need to face it. So, I started from the position that the theoretical paradigms on which I have depended to make sense of the world up until now are falling short in explaining and addressing the painful challenges we face at this time. These challenges are part of living in a globalized world under advanced capitalism and include, but are not limited to, the climate crisis, the so-called refugee crisis, a growing gap between the haves and the have-nots, the global COVID-19 pandemic, and many other points. Climate change and the ecological crisis lies at the heart of geopolitics and cannot be divorced from issues related to injustice and inequalities. So this is where I'm starting from. And as I said, it took me on a journey. down, 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 down. And I come here today with new concepts and new ideas that they're still going on in my head. And I'm certainly not presenting any solutions today. There's a lot of confusion in my head, but this is where I'm at and this is what I'm going with. I studied degree, youth and community studies, and a master's in youth and community studies before I did my PhD on non-formal education, but I don't really have a philosophical grounding. I did go back to philosophy though, and here's the third, Sofia, philosophia, the love of wisdom, and the need to come up with new ideas. And I'm going back to the Renaissance and the Vitruvian man. I'll start again with a question around baby Sofia and cyborg Sofia and what it means to be human. Now, feminist theory, queer theory, anti-racist theory, post-colonial theory, they have already done so much to critique the Vitruvian man that is placed at the center as the ideal human, creating, if you will, a hierarchy of humans. So what I'm presenting today is not anti-human, and it certainly isn't not for my love for my fellow species, but I am critiquing the human with a capital H that lies at the center here, the white, able-bodied, heterosexual man. I'm looking at the less than human others, the animals and the environment. Sorry, let me word this again. I am questioning the thinking that has led to the less than human others and the animals and the environment, and how they have come to be seen as an exploitable source and a means to an end that has been driven by, and has also fed through, capitalism. Drawing on the work of Braidotti and her new materialism, I'm defining the post-human as resting on a critique of the human ideal, the humanist ideal of man, which places the Western male, the white able-bodied subject, as the ideal subject. But with that, I'm also looking at post-anthropocentrism, which questions the notion that man lies at the center of the universe, that as a species, humans are, in any way, exceptional, and that all other beings, animals and plants, are simply a means to an end. So what I'm advancing is a critical post-human theory that lies at this intersection. Critical post-human theory advances a radical repositioning on the part of the subject. It rejects the hierarchical relations that continue to privilege some men over others, whilst at the same time questioning the notion of human exceptionalism. I'm looking at new ways to engage with the complexities around globalization, technology, advanced capitalism, and climate change. So here I'm going to talk a little bit about new materialism, which is it's a new way of thinking, if you like. A new way of thinking, and then I'll look at how this might inform youth work and youth work practice. So new materialism represents a politically committed and evolving area of inquiry that includes and extends beyond the human and socially constructed material conditions. So it's presenting new ways of thinking. Is a research methodology for the non-dualistic study of the world within, beside, and among us, the world that precedes us, includes us, and exceeds us. It necessarily crosses disciplinary boundaries. It dawned on me recently that how can we begin to understand young people's lives by limiting ourselves to social theory? Now that I've come to this point, I don't know how can we do that? How can we limit understanding young people's lives without thinking about their relationship with the non-social, with the non-human? And that raises new questions about relationality and a relational practice. So it builds on feminist theories, post-colonial theory, critical race theory, queer theory, and also builds on environmental studies and many, many more. It is transdisciplinary. I'm looking at a polycentric, but situated, embodied and embrained and embedded approach which enables a theoretical turn away from the humanist tradition of dualism, including nature, culture, mind and body, the human science and the natural science. Let's transcend these borders. Not throw anything away, but see how we can transcend the borders and build on it. It seeks to dislodge the anthropocentric ideas around matter and meaning that have dominated mainstream theories for centuries. So it's curiouser and curiouser. I'm starting with Baruch Spinoza, which I'm not going to go into, but that's how far back I had to go to be able to start understanding. Moving away from some of the Kantian ethics that have informed Western philosophy and drawing on Spinoza, who back in the 17th century spoke about God or nature as being one and the same thing. I'm drawing on the work of Barad, who asked us to look at our understanding of what it means to be human. To be entangled is not simply to be intertwined with one another, as in the joining of separate entities, but to lack an independent, self-contained existence. Existence is not an individual affair. Individuals do not pre-exist their interactions. Individuals emerge through and as a part of their entangled intra-relating. We depend on each other. We are entangled. You cannot move away from that entanglement. And I'd like to think a little bit about Gaia, as Earth, as Gaia, as a totality of living things and materials that were made together, that cannot live apart, and from which humans cannot extract themselves. And this is where it becomes really complex. I'm presenting an ontology of immanence, developing and building on the work of Spinoza and Deleuze and other, making the argument that matter, and what we are is matter, is knowing. That it's not just the human that is knowing, that the plants are knowing, that animals are knowing. Matter, and we are part of matter, is knowing. And that raises the question, what matters? We can look at agentic forces within Gaia beyond the anthropos, which means rethinking subjectivity as relationality, which raises the question, what are we becoming? It also raises the question, who are we? When I received the notes for the Offenburg talks, there was many references to we. And I started with that, well, what is this we? Who is this we? Is it the white European? Is it humanity? Or is it everything within Gaia? You'll be familiar with this image, the pyramid and the circle. And God only knows, I'd come across it a million times, but I never really thought about it. I never really thought about the implications for youth work. So you can see here the human at the top of the pyramid, the hierarchy, and you can see the second image with a human part of the rest of living matter. And I think in simple terms, what I'm suggesting is we need to shift from this to this. To think about new youth work models. Youth work theory needs to think beyond the human in order to respond to the climate crisis and the ongoing ecological destruction. Davies speaks about tipping the balance of power in favor of young people. And I'm saying, well, before we tip the balance of power, we need to think about it. How does that impact young people's relationships with the rest of the planet beyond the human? Raises questions about autonomy and independence. So youth work has already evolved in its efforts to decenter the human with a capital H. In my own work on youth work, I accused youth work practice and youth work theory specifically of adopting what I call the citizenship assumption, the assumption that all young people have the right to rights. My work with young refugees demonstrated very, very clearly to me that these young people apparently don't have the right to rights that the rest of us take for granted. And now I'm arguing that youth work theories are anthropocentric, and they're built on anthropocentric theories. And in order to move beyond that, we need to rethink things rather than just add in environmental issues and stir it all up. We need new ways of thinking. Youth work is focused on the social to the detriment of the natural. I think we should be looking beyond the social-natural binary. Acknowledging the remnants of knowledge and how it feeds into what we know and how we know it, in order to be able to transform it. Young people are not just social beings. We are human animals, and we need to look beyond the human and beyond the binaries. So most of my work in youth work, I would consider myself Freirean in many ways. I've always looked to Paulo Freire to inform my youth work ideas, my theory, and also my practice. And so I thought, let me pick on Freire to show how anthropocentric someone who has influenced me so much has been. That doesn't mean that I'm now going to ignore Paulo Freire, but I think this is part of the critical lens that we need to bring to the table. So this is Corman speaking about Freire's work. Freire's ontological claims regarding non-human animals have generated scant critical commentary. Indeed, despite the arguably progressive thrust of pedagogy of the oppressed, the speciesism and unrelenting anthropocentrism of the text remains largely unchallenged. My main concern is that the consequences of these discursive gestures include the implicit and explicit denial of animal subjectivities and, in relation, animal oppression. For example, according to his pedagogical methodology, animals are crucially placed outside the capacity for dialogue. For Freire, the defining capacity and activity of the subject, and consequently placed outside the possibility for liberation. For Freire, an act is oppressive only when it prevents people from being more fully human. That kind of ideological orientation, representative of the anthropocentric and speciesist underpinnings of the entire text, should garner serious attention. And that's what I'm suggesting today. So youth work theories tend to argue that youth work remains primarily concerned with people. And here I'm drawing on Seal. And my question is, but should it though? That doesn't mean that we're not concerned with people, but should it be primarily concerned or exclusively concerned with people? And what about a relational praxis that moves beyond the human animal? Humans, non-humans, and discourse are ontologically entwined, raising new questions around the nature of language, meaning, and subjectivity, and how this feeds into questions around ontology, ethics and values, and I think we haven't really spoken about that much in the last couple of days, a transformative youth work praxis. So I've picked up on a couple of points just to sort of drive this point home. And I'm citing Jamie's work here, but it's Jamie citing the Council of Europe report and also the Third European Youth Work Convention. And I quote, "A climate crisis of which young people are acutely aware, which undoubtedly endangers social cohesion and diminishes the quality of life, presenting ultimately an existential threat." Yes, we are facing an existential threat, but not just humans. The Council of Europe youth sector has been mandated and tasked with promoting and protecting young people's access to rights. The argument being with special emphasis on improving institutional responses to emerging issues affecting young people's rights and their transition to adulthood, such as, but not limited to, the effects of climate change and environmental degradation. As if we need to fix the planet because that's our human right, which essentially makes it all about me again. And that is what I'm questioning. it's that kind of ethical thinking that places the anthros at the center that I think we need to rethink. That doesn't mean that I'm throwing the baby out with the bathwater. God only knows I rely on human rights in my work all the time. But I think we should be asking new questions. Young says that youth work is an exercise in moral philosophy. Philosophia as the process of discovery. And Deleuze argues that philosophy is about creating new concepts and in a creative way, if you like. So I'm looking at creating concepts that draw on different perspectives. Perspectives that are situated and beyond the human, embedded and embodied, a politics of location. And I think this also addresses the concerns that have been raised about the disenfranchised youth who can't afford to put food on his table. We need to be thinking about the individual, about the local, about the regional and the global and the planetary, but all linked together. It's not one or the other. It's not either or, beyond the binary. So I'm looking at immanence and the unity of matter, and here I include humans in this matter, and the entanglement of matter and meaning. Linking the human animal to the non-human and acknowledging knowing and being. And immanence as a differential principle that is both unique and diverse, that is beyond hierarchies and beyond binaries, that's moved beyond nature culture, that's moved beyond social natural, beyond human science and natural science, and also beyond adult and child. Young people transcend this border already. It's about linking the human animal to the non-human and in a transdisciplinary way. If there's one thing we know, is that when we, I was walking this morning with Val, and we were commenting on the beautiful grey sky, and I became aware that, the climate affects me, and it affects all of us. The grey skies, the blue skies, the temperatures affect us. When I'm with nature in something like this, I feel good. And nature affects me, and I affect nature. And the non-human is clever too. Yes, we're special in terms of being thinking, rational beings, embodied and embrained, but we have flamingos that fly over Malta at this time of the year. They have a map somewhere. They know where they're flying. There is intelligence beyond the human. So what we know as youth workers is transmitted to future generations. Knowledge transmission is ongoing, and so it reaches into the future. So I'm looking at youth work for the future as well, as an ongoing process, and asking, what is youth work becoming? Youth work practice that embraces knowing and being, understanding and transforming, and asking new questions. What does it mean to be human? What about baby Sofia? What about cyborg Sofia? What matters beyond the human? How and why? And what are we becoming? How might we live? Not how should we live, how might we live? This is a creative practice of asking new questions. I'm looking at a critical post-human youth work towards a more than human pedagogy. Cynicism is compliance, and there is no room here for dystopic sentiments. It is an affirmative, creative process, because hope is a political act. And I guess what I'm saying is what Nick said, let the world in, but let the non-human world in, and be open to new ways of conceptualizing and understanding the world. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Maria, very much for widening, I think, our scope of awareness in this. It was actually interesting, but I think from here you could not see. So the moment you said that the world is burning, there was actually the fire department just in front of there. I was wondering, oh, the house is burning. I said, the house is burning, and we had literally there. It was an interesting signal. So, questions to Maria? Thoughts, comments? Jamie? No, you don't have a microphone, yes.
Thank you, Maria. It was really interesting. And thank you for pointing out the anthropocentric elements of the work that I did. And as you heard in our previous discussion here, I spoke about Donna Haraway being sort of a hobby of mine. I really enjoy her work and her ideas, and I feel like they get to the heart of some of these big existential questions that we're faced. But I struggle to find a way to bring it into my work, as you see, and as you rightly point out. So I wonder, recognizing you're also sort of still grappling with these questions, what advice do you offer to us to really practically move this conversation forward?
I mean, and my critique of your points was, this is all a self-critique at the same time, Jamie, that, a sudden awareness of this anthropocentric lens. You might want to look at the work of Fox and Aldred. They're already using new materialism to understand young people and young people's lives. And I think Haraway kind of has informed new materialism in a huge way. I mean, even, for example, in her work on companion species, so even there, I think, already looking at relationality beyond the human. We talk about youth work practice as a relational practice. And what she is saying is, what is our relationship with the dog? And I would start with that. What is our relationship beyond the human? Not decentering, I'm decentering the human with a capital H. But that doesn't mean that the young people that we're working with aren't important. Not at all. I would never start. I'm still going to go back and continue my work with young refugees. And there I would say we're building on the post-colonial anti-racist thing that human was never completely, we weren't always part of that human. We're still not, many of us. So there's descent of that human, and at the same time, look at our relationship, that companion species, and how we relate as matter and not just as human beings, entangled.
Thank you.
Even the term companion, which I thought was really interesting, is about breaking bread together. So who do we break bread with beyond the human?
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
It's not really a question, it's more of a remark. For me, it all comes down to the things I've said earlier in the past few days. It's about caring for each other, caring for the planet, and giving a voice to the voiceless. We see these kind of things emerging within the whole climate and sustainability movement, and it's becoming very tangible. Rivers that get rights, the concept of the parliament of things, where you have a parliament of people who represent things, animals, rivers, who do not have a voice. There's a whole artistic movement that uses it. It is being adopted by movements like Extinction Rebellion. I'm thinking about artists like Lotte van den Berg, who is a Dutch artist. She has the concept of artistic concept of building conversation, where she takes the audience into creating empathy through becoming the object, playing the role of the object with the audience. It's a very interactive session. I think these kind of methods can also be used within youth work. What would the river think that would happen if we continue doing what we do, and force an audience, civilians, into that consideration? So it can be done really practically.
And that, I think, my point is certainly this: I'm not giving anything new, and that's why I went back to I went back to the slide here, but it's not showing there, of the pyramid and the circle. I mean, the first time I saw that image was years ago. That's definitely not new, but I think, like I said, I was on that runway, and it was a sense of this isn't working. The theories that I'm working with aren't making sense. When you have a burning planet and young people stuck in a camp, something's not making sense. And I'm just presenting a new way of thinking about youth work. I don't know why it's...
We've been talking about ecological, economic, and social sustainability. But one of the images which used to be like 3 circles with one like a Venn diagram with the one center where they all overlap, and that's the sustainable point where we have to get as a society, as a world. But recent years, that picture has been redrawn as 3 concentric circles, where the ecologic outer circle is the most important. We have to deal with the ecologic boundaries we have, and the human circle, the economic circle, is in the middle. So there is a shift, a mind shift in the perception on how we approach sustainability, and it fits the image that you bring. So it's already present in the climate and sustainability movements. Now we should just get it in the hearts and the heads of everybody else.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Are there questions, comments? You have a microphone there.
Also more just a reflection that I am having, just share my thoughts, because I was thinking maybe in what ways do the Sustainable Development Goals maybe have like a little post-human approach in a way, because they do focus, goals specifically targeted on human beings, but they also have very explicit goals that, life underwater, life on land and so on, biodiversity, which are goals, being worthy in themselves and not only to save our own asses, so to say. So, I was just thinking about that, if maybe it is a step, or what do you think, is this maybe a step in the right direction, or...
it's clear that there are many things that are happening that I would define as positive, but I still go back to anthropocentrism, and I still go back to the capitalocene that Haraway. Just this morning when I was getting ready, I saw on the BBC News that the IMF is saying that we're not going to get out of this rut, this economic rut, because of vaccine inequality. And it was all duh. That's not rocket science, and yet here we are. Here we are, where we continue to see these inequalities and huge violations of human rights, and yes, steps in the right direction, but not enough. And so I still go back to what are the frameworks that we're working with, because is it about transformation or is it about tweaking? And if we're still putting the human being at the center, then are we really going to get out of this?
Thank you.
Thanks for the presentation. I've got a slightly unfair sentiment, because unfair because I'm uncomfortable. I'm kind of with you and Haraway and Rose Brodotti and all the others, but then when I'm with you, I'm feeling quite uncomfortable because of the spectre of eco-fascism, let's say, which after all calls for the sacrifice of individual rights to the organic whole of nature, is one way of, and as you're well aware of, despite the attempts to pull away the theoretical framework from its kind of Heideggerian origins of questioning the place of man and so on, there's always something of a risk of falling back into, instead of Vitruvian man, a kind of wolf who behaves as a wolf. And so I think, I think it's important, it's incumbent on us to be aware of that, and also to notice, and then aware of that, I notice that in contemporary political tendencies, if I think of the far right in France, it also has this aspect of companionship with the animals and so on. It's a sort of curious but frequent association. And so, I sort of feel like we have to work harder to be able to explain how we go in the direction of extension of rights and not annihilation of the individuality of rights. Yeah, you see what I mean.
And I realize that what I'm saying is provocative, but I like I said, I'm not going to go back to Malta and abandon human rights. That's not going to happen. But at the same time, I'm questioning it. I mean, we speak about 2015. I've been working with refugees for the last 17, 18 years, and we need to go back much, much further than that and see a history where rights are being violated every single day. We are letting them die. Our inaction, no, it's not just our actions are causing people to die. So I have to question these tools and ideas that I depend on at the same time in my work. And I recognize the inherent contradiction there, but I'm saying let's embrace that contradiction and work through it, because something's not working. So, you know, that you can do both. That's what I'm saying. And I think we need to do both. And that means having uncomfortable conversations with where we're at. Because the human rights paradigm right now, whilst I turn to it, is in many ways not worth the paper it's written on.
Thank you. Christine.
If I just really quickly can respond directly to the point that you made. Something that I think we could also do is maybe look at, you know, there are actually examples for people having a more holistic approach towards nature, and the idea that you suggested that, you know, do we lose our rights or do we become like a wolf? Well, I mean, if we look at some indigenous cultures who are still really living closely attached to nature, I think no. So actually we can learn from, maybe that's an example to look, okay, how would that look like in practice, and how do these people live? And I think they have a much more an approach that goes into your direction, because they are so strongly interconnected with nature. And yeah, just to take this as some kind of best practice, if you like, and learn from it.
Thank you. Jamie?
To my mind, this goes back to the point that you both make about letting the world in. So yes, we see across Europe, I think, a strange convergence of the far right and the New Age and environmental movements, and in a sort of a movement that I don't really fully understand myself. But the difference to my mind is about where do we set our boundaries, where do we set our borders. And so it's not a surprise to me, Maria, that you're coming to this sort of work from exploring it in terms of refugee rights, because it's about, are we saying we're building you know, in any community, they have to define where the border is, and is the border inclusive and plural and porous, or is it exclusive? And the eco-fascists and the fascists would have an exclusive border, defining themselves in relation to another, versus a more pluralistic vision of that I think, Maria, you're kind of calling for.
Yeah, and I think what I'm saying as well is youth work is about conversation, and the most that we can do is just shift the paradigm in terms of these conversations. And I'm not saying, so this is how the world needs to be. What I'm saying is let's sit down with young people, shift our conceptual lens, and start thinking of new ways that we might not just fix the planet, but also fix our species and work with the other species at the same time. I'm not presenting a roadmap. I'm saying we need new tools to think about the world and what is living and how we might continue to live together.
Yes. I was wondering, Maria, since yesterday after Lasse's point of hesitation, I was wondering if you see the two pictures, pyramid and the circle, what's the hesitation to move from one to another? And perhaps maybe there's a price to pay on that.
Loss of privilege as human species, I'd say, is the price to pay.
There are already quite a lot of tools to work on this with young people and also with adults. I don't know if any of you is familiar with deep ecology, but it's a lot about what you were saying today in your presentation, which I liked a lot. Thank you. So if anyone is interested in delving deeper on it, Deep Ecology by Joanna Macy in particular, she has a lot of tools in her book, The Work That Reconnects. And yeah, I suggest that you have a look at that, because it's all about that. It's all about thinking of everything as a whole, holistically, and not us in the center, but moving from that anthropocentric way of saying things to a more ecocentric way. Yeah.
Thank you. And no, I'm not familiar with it because I don't come with that green background, and I look forward to reading more of it.
Thank you, Maria. That was inspiring and for certainly thought-moving. So we'll see what the frames of reference has been shaken this afternoon. So thank you very much.